Good afternoon, subscribers, and welcome along. Today I'm going to be considering the whole notion of oligopoly. If you look in my playlist, you will find, I think that there is actually a playlist for market structures, and you will find that I've already done one video with regard to oligopoly. But I've just been covering this once again with my upper sixth students, and there was a couple of issues which I thought, you really need to go over this. So I bring you this in addition to the previous video in my playlist. Now, the reason that we've been looking at this specifically today is because in your A-level exams you will be faced with three papers. Paper 1, microeconomics, paper 2, macroeconomics, and of course paper 3 is the themes paper. And it is the themes paper which is the synoptic paper, i.e. you need to be able to assimilate micro and macroeconomics and apply it where appropriate. But you also need to, not only do you need to know the knowledge and understanding, you've got to have the knowledge, you've got to have the understanding, but let's remember that's a very basic skill. And you can probably teach most people to learn some theory and regurgitate it at the appropriate point. But the skill in this synoptic paper, in this themes paper, is can you take that knowledge and understanding and then can you apply it, can you analyse, can you evaluate within the context of the question. Now the question that I've been looking at with my students is from the June 2018 paper, actually the most recent paper, where part of the question asked candidates to consider the bicycle market and the bicycle industry. And so for that reason, ladies and gentlemen, I'm running through this whole notion of oligopoly again. Okay, so let's talk diagrams first of all. I think for the oligopoly market, you can get away with a very simple diagram and still get full marks. So this is the very simplistic diagram that we have here, showing the demand curve or the average revenue curve as you know it. So it's elastic and then it's inelastic. And as you know, that is referred to as the kinked demand curve, the KDC, the kinked demand curve, or the Sweezy model as it's otherwise known. And the price, equilibrium price, or what we refer to as the point at which prices are rigid, so we've got price rigidity here, is at P star and Q star. Now, the whole point here is, ladies and gentlemen, that we're trying to consider, we're trying to model the pressures and the thinking which is going on in the mind of a firm which is operating within an oligopolistic market. So, if the price is P star, why will the firm not increase its price? Well, that's simply not rational, is it? Because if I'm in an oligopoly market where I've got a number of competitors, all of similar size, why on earth would I increase my price? So if we think of the supermarket industry, for example, so we've got Tesco, Asda, Sainsbury, etc. Well, if Tesco increases its prices, everybody will maybe, or certainly rationally anyway, they go to Asda, or they go to Sainsbury's, or they go to Aldi, or they would go to an alternative. So, in this instance, within the model of oligopoly, increasing your price is seen as self-defeating because you're going to lose custom and as a consequence revenue. So hence that is very elastic because it indicates that a small rise in your price will have quite a significant dampening effect on quantity demanded and hence your revenue. Well, what about the alternative? What if I wish to attract customers from Asda to Tesco? Why don't I, as Tesco, reduce my prices? Well, if I reduce my prices, my competitors are watching what I do. And so if I reduce my prices, they will reduce theirs as well. So the net effect is simply that neither of us will gain, and actually we might sell the same number of goods to the same number of people, but our revenue drops off. And in order to illustrate that, we would illustrate that by way of an inelastic demand curve, because the percentage increase in quantity demanded is not sufficient to negate the reduction in price. And of course, those of you who are familiar with your elasticities, I'm not going to go over that here, but that's all to do with the relationship between revenue and price elasticity of demand. So for that reason, ladies and gentlemen, prices are rigid at P star and Q star. So therefore, the dilemma is this. If I, as an individual firm, cannot do anything about the price by myself, well, maybe if we all got together and we all acted together and we all came to an agreement together, then perhaps it might be in our best interests to get together to, as we know, that's called collusion. So we might collude and we might agree a price. So if we all agreed to lift the price, then neither of us would be adversely affected, then neither of us would lose custom, and indeed it's more likely that the total revenue that we earn would actually go up. So the incentive to collude actually is stemming from this whole notion of the fact that prices are rigid. And why are prices rigid? Due to the elastic nature of demand above P star and below P star. So we get together and collude. Now, when we collude, we are in essence then acting as one. And so one could develop this to say that actually this notion of collusion is really moving towards a monopoly position. And you'll remember that monopoly is where we have one single supplier. Now, monopolies, as you know, they earn abnormal profits by restricting output. So a great way to illustrate this would be as follows. So your standard average revenue, marginal revenue curves. And for simplicity and to keep things simple, long run marginal cost equals long run average cost. Now, where does the monopoly firm maximize profit? Where MC equals MR, which is of course here. How do we get the price? We go up to the demand curve and we go across. So that would be P, and that would be, let's call it P star and Q star. So by acting as one, by colluding, the individual firms have in effect monopoly power. Therefore they earn that area there, which is the abnormal rent, and they eat into the consumer surplus, because under that position the consumer surplus is simply A, B, P1. It's that triangle, area above price and below demand. Now of course, if this market were more competitive, the price would be lower and the triangle would get bigger. But by restricting the quantity demanded, by moving it back in this direction, consumer surplus is falling. And indeed the most competitive price, as you well know, is here, where we would be saying that P is equal to MC, and hence we'd have quite a substantial area of consumer surplus. So collusion is very much to the benefit of the producers, of the suppliers, and very much to the detriment here of the consumer. Now, I said that you could probably get away with this as a very basic diagram, and it is a very basic diagram. And so you may wish to embellish it slightly by adding a few other things, which I'll just show you. So you could add the marginal revenue curve. As you know, there's a discontinuity in it, so end up something like that, MR. And this discontinuity means that marginal costs, marginal cost curve, they can fluctuate anywhere between this discontinuity in the marginal revenue curve, and the price won't change. In other words, the oligopoly firm will absorb changes in costs up to a certain limit, obviously, and consequently the price to the consumer doesn't change. Now, that's good, isn't it? Because some consumers, they like that stability in the price. Marginal cost could be there, it could be there, it could be there, and all the time price is the same. Now the other thing that you could obviously add as well would be maybe an average total cost curve. So I could add an ATC there like so. There's the minimum, MC cuts ATC at its minimum, but the key point here is that the cost would be there, and hence the abnormal profit of the oligopolist would be there. Now again, you can see that the oligopoly firm could therefore be relatively inefficient, so have a much higher average total cost curve, maybe something like that, but still make some abnormal profit, which would be that area in this instance. So there's all that flex there within the oligopoly market to absorb costs, be they imposed by the outside or self-imposed due to X inefficiencies, but the price to the consumer won't change. Now let's talk then, ladies and gentlemen, about this whole notion of a collusive agreement. Now of course, explicit collusion is not legal, and this is something which is monitored and looked into by the Competition and Markets Authority, so always good to get in something about the Competition and Markets Authority. And indeed, not only do they monitor it, they offer incentives for firms and industries who they think are colluding to grass up their competitors. So if they got if they got wind that you were in a particular industry and there was a bit of collusive activity going on, the deal is this. If they're onto you and you grass up your collusive partner, well, they'll be fined heavily and you get off scot-free. Now this happened a few years ago with Virgin Atlantic and British Airways, and if you Google this you can read up on it. So the airline industry, they were accused of fixing the prices of transatlantic flights, and the CMA got wind of it, and one of the firms grassed up the other. So the firm which was in that case the supergrass in effect, gets off scot-free, and the other one gets an enormous fine. So there's an incentive there for companies to break the collusive agreement if they think that they're going to get found out. But there's also, of course, an incentive if you enter into collusive agreement, because human nature is that you'll always, there's that film, isn't it, Wall Street, where Gordon Gekko, he's always saying that greed is good. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with that, but what I'm saying is that there is that profit motive, and if you're in a collusive agreement, there is an incentive, therefore, to break the collusive agreement because you think that you can do better by yourself. Now, if you were talking about oligopoly, therefore, and you wanted to talk about collusive agreements and the temptation to break these collusive agreements, then you would obviously mention game theory, probably John Nash, as portrayed by that actor, Australian actor, what is his name? Oh, I can't remember now. In the film A Beautiful Mind. What's his name? Richard, somebody, maybe. Anyway, if you Google A Beautiful Mind, that's all about this whole notion of the Nash equilibrium. So game theory is a mathematical, strategic modelling system which attempts to explain or attempts to model how firms would react to their competitors' decisions. So if they get together and they collude, well, what incentive might there be for them to break that collusive agreement? Or if I offer you a sweetener to break a collusive agreement, how likely is it that you will do that, and what will be the benefits to you and what will be the costs to the firm that does not? So that whole notion of game theory, Nash equilibrium, the prisoner's dilemma, as it's probably referred to in your A-level textbook, that's something also worth mentioning on questions about oligopoly. Not that you have to go into it and explain it in great detail, but it is worth a mention.